last speaker kind of showed a little bit how you might start to use machine learning in a creative way. And I'm really interested as an artist in why you would want to do that. Machine learning has become more and more prevalent in the international fine arts scene, but there's not really kind of a language to talk about it beyond the scientific, to explore how using this technique in this new, different artistic context might give it a different kind of thing, and how it should be judged perhaps in a different way. Because producing an image using machine learning versus any other way, painting, photography, gives the viewer different experiences, expectation, and histories and context to consider. And I'm really interested in what are these associations and how might they be used in a piece to kind of further that message or further that kind of understanding of what you're trying to do. When you come to look at a piece produced by a machine, you automatically have different reactions and connections than if it was produced by a human. And I'm interested in whether the algorithms and the training sets can become actors and agents within the artistic process in the way that other materials like oil paints or charcoal or video can. And can these reactions be used to push a piece? And so that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the materiality of the training sets and a little bit about the materiality of the algorithms. And forgive me, all of the scientists in the room, because I will be talking about it in an extremely non-technical way. And then talk about how I've been trying to use this in two projects that I'm working on at the moment. So to start with, kind of like the artificial intelligence community, research community, has long been interested whether machines can create true art. And there's a little bit of anxiety, I would argue, in the creative community about this. Jürgen Schmidhuber, a professor of artificial intelligence, created a formal theory of creativity in like the 90s, which tried to break down art into a series of novel patterns that a machine can learn, which to me is mildly terrifying. And last summer, researchers trained GAN, a generative adversarial network, which I'm going to come back to, on thousands of classical paintings in order for it to use this knowledge to produce works that were rated by human beings as being better than those produced by artists, which are these images here. So it's trained on lots and lots of kind of classical paintings, and then it was given to people to rate. And it's really interesting, and they kind of used as the baseline the human-produced paintings for them to be compared to were images from Art Basel, I think. And what's interesting in this kind of like in the machine learning kind of technical community, much of the focus of the work about whether something is art or not art has been to consider and judge the results, the images that come out, through the impact of visual parameters on the viewer. So kind of like, does this look like art? Which kind of ignores quite a lot of the considerations that you have as an artist when producing a piece, kind of like when you think through the use of materials and kind of like what is your intent. And for me, that's kind of missing in some of this research that's going on. And can something really be art without these two things? If it's just kind of like produced by a machine, is it art, or is it kind of like without kind of like this intent? So I'm going to talk through why I've chosen to use machine learning rather than something else, and how it's possible to use the fundamental nature of how machine learning works to bring out themes, and how it's possible to use this in a creative practice, not just to showcase the technology, because I would argue some of the videos that you showed just are kind of showcasing technology, but rather as a way of engaging in some broader ideas. So first of all, as I said, when you're working with it, there are two main materials, the data or training set and the algorithm. Everyone today has talked about data and training sets, which is a little bit unusual in an artistic context. The training sets or images kind of like provide the knowledge that for the algorithms and are central to the eventual image output. The data sets that are needed are usually extremely, extremely large, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of images and inputs, and often proprietary. So often they belong to people and you can't just freely access them, which is difficult as an artist. So there are a small number that are open source, which kind of form the backbone of machine learning projects in science and art. But most of the training sets that are readily available are compiled by researchers, often using Mechanical Turks, which you mentioned, which, as an artist, there's this kind of invisible labor there. and the associated power relations of that kind of like are rarely acknowledged when you start to talk about these things. And these training sets are put together using a variety of different methodologies, but because people are always involved in some point, either in the source content or in the process of labeling, these data sets inevitably come to enshrine cultural or social attitude, otherwise known as dataset bias. For example, this is ImageNet, which is a canonical dataset that is used lots and lots and lots in so many different projects, with over 14 million images in it. If you look what beauty, if you look for the term beauty, it's white, predominantly Western, and young, and so you're kind of replicating this bias if you're not really considering every single image in your data set, which for me, as an artist who's like interested in the hidden and the forgotten, becomes very problematic. And with these huge data sets, it's almost impossible to look through every single image. You just can't. And so the amount of control that you have, what's included or excluded, what bias and prejudices you're replicating and repeating, is very difficult to control. And this is something that really, really interests me, and it is something that I'm kind of working through. Oh yeah, this is another one from the same data set, which is, if you look up monster, there are pictures of Frankenstein, but then there are also pictures of kind of like disabled people and people who don't conform to kind of like social norms. So that's kind of like some of the issues that arise from data sets that you can start to play with in a creative practice. And then once you have your data set, then you have to kind of run it through an algorithm. And again, this is very basic. So I'm really interested, I use in my work GANs, or generative adversarial networks, which within the machine learning community are notoriously unstable and also not that well understood. We've talked about black boxes. It's a complex iterative processes with many interdependencies. For the GAN to be constructed, one artificial intelligence network is trained on the training set, which it then uses to try and create a realistic version of an image that could potentially come from there. The second AI, I suppose, looks at these creative images and then decides whether they're real or fake, or true or counterfeit. As the second network is very, very good at judging the images that could not pass, the first AI learns to mimic imagery to the extent that, and this is from the original GAN paper, that the counterfeits are indistinguishable from the genuine articles over the course of many cycles of learning or epochs. And for me, what's interesting in kind of like this description of this process that kind of comes from the technical detail is the use of the word counterfeit, because it suggests a lack of truth to these images, that they're not quite real, and that there's a fakeness. But the images that are produced are not merely copies of what was in the training set, but entirely new images that have been created from the knowledge of what it has seen. So when you run these programs and the images that are created and outputted are labeled as fake, is that really true? And is that something, this idea of truth and falseness, is that something that you can start to play with in your work? So the project that I'm going to talk briefly about is a project that this is very, very much work in progress. It's a project that I'm working on at the moment, which is drawing historical parallels from tulip mania that spread across the Netherlands and Europe in the 1630s to the speculation that's ongoing around cryptocurrencies. So I'm creating a video work that is generated using GANs that will show a tulip blooming, an updated version of the Dutch still life for the 21st century. Tulip mania, if you do not know, is when the price of tulips went to as high as a townhouse. And then it crashed really, really quickly and became as cheap as an onion. And one of the things that happened in it was that stripy tulips were the most expensive because nobody knew how the stripes came about, and people do mad things like try and paint the ground where the tulips were growing to encourage stripes. So the appearance of the tulip that I'm making is going to be controlled by the Bitcoin price, but rather than say that as the Bitcoin price rises, it becomes more stripy. So the stripe will depend on the value of Bitcoin, changing it over the time to show how the market fluctuates. And I wanted to draw these ideas around capitalism value and the tangible and intangible nature of speculation and collapse from two different but similar moments in history. But I could have done, and this is just a little GIF of the tulips, like the tulips that I are training, so this is just a background. But why use this method? Why do it using it again? I wanted to make sure that the use was not merely a tool, but acts as another way of understanding the subject matter. Because as I mentioned, GANs are notoriously unstable, and what happens is that they really, if you use them, they tend to have this tendency to look like they're improving, that they're getting better and better and better, and then suffer mode collapse and just kind of stop working and crash, which is really similar to how stock markets behave. Something will go up and up and up and up, and then it will crash, and there's no real kind of like sense of what caused that to crash. So as kind of like I'm using this method to kind of like encapsulate the beauty of the tulip, its collapse will kind of mirror the ups and downs of speculative bubbles, because you can kind of see in some of the, like as this goes on, sometimes it will just collapse and break. Also, you know, there is the tradition of tulips in art history. They featured prominently in the Dutch still life at the time, the so-called vanitas paintings, which kind of illustrated that beauty and treasure are only fleeting. And what's nice about kind of like using this is that this kind of like picture could never exist in real life, because all of the flowers would bloom at different times. So it's an imagined piece. It's an imagined flower bouquet. Similarly to how I'm trying to, like the AI is imagining flowers. They're not real flowers. They're things that have been constructed from what it's known. So it's, again, kind of like using how these things work to kind of echo a history of painting that already exists. And to make this, because there is no data set of millions of tulips, I've had to make it myself, which has driven me slowly insane. So I'm currently, I think I'll need about 30,000 images of tulips to make it work, and I'm currently about a third of the way through. But by creating my own data set, it forces me to examine each image and kind of inverts the usual process of this kind of creation, because there's a huge difference from pulling down a large amount of images from the internet, from a Google search, like a flower or a tulip, and taking 20,000, 30,000 photos yourself. When you do the latter, you notice things, and I really started to notice variations in tulips. Like there's no perfect ideal one. Each has kind of very minor variations, because you're looking for differences rather than similarities, because that will produce interesting results. And what I found is that there is the process of creating a data set is almost like craft, and I've started reading a lot about craft theory. It's repetitive and time-consuming, but absolutely necessary in order to produce something beautiful. And there is a skill to it. It's something that, like craft, which is often dismissed as being kind of like relative, you know, like low value, and kind of like something that isn't kind of like as skilled as something more in the hierarchy of art. There is a real skill to it. If the data set is too big, if there are too many images, the results will look kind of too good, and the quirks and the oddities that make, for me, using this an interesting medium will start to disappear. But if it's too small, or if it doesn't have enough information, it will become kind of flummoxed or confused, either producing nothing or only one or two variations from the training set again and again. So there's this necessity of kind of like understanding how the data sets work and what you can add to it and what you can remove, which for me is a huge part of how you can start to use this in a creative process. So this is just very, very poor quality, because this only happened when I had like 1,000 images. But just to give you an idea. But this idea of control is misleading. This is an early test of a tulip moving through latent space, or kind of like it moving across a map of all possible ideas that come out of the idea of a tulip. It's impossible to predict what is going to come out. I can guess, but I cannot know. And the image that I mentioned that the quirks and oddities make it interesting, because like this style that comes out of a GAN, particularly in a poorly trained model, a model that is only given a small amount of data or trained only for a few epochs, is kind of ruined and decaying and decomposing, kind of antithetical to kind of a large proportion of the aesthetics of digital art. And it almost has an organic quality in and of itself. Like you can see that they're studied with artifacts and the errors that expose the artificial nature of the image that is produced, and the results that kind of, like artifacts are produced when they're in the uneven overlap of kind of like how a GAN works. And these imperfections or traces of process is a quality that I think really, really is interesting when working with this. Because, and it's almost like there's a finite amount of time where for these imperfections to exist in this process, because the technology industry wants realism, and advancements in computer vision try to minimize these mistakes. And working with this, it's not a static technology. Like it seems like every week a new version is coming out, each of which create a slightly different look. And so when you make work with it, it adds a certain element of impermanence and temporality to working with it as a medium and a material. I've also explored some of these ideas in another piece I made, which was an animation, Fall of the House of Usher. This is the training set that I hand drew that is showing on the screen. And it's a piece that could have been done, again, using hand animation, but by choosing to use machine learning, I was able to heighten and increase themes around the role of the creator, the reciprocity between art and technology, and aspects of memory in a way that would not be available to me otherwise. So again, I made a training set of about 200 drawings, because I've talked a lot about kind of like the need for like large data sets, but there are small batch machine learning programs, such as Pix2Pix, which require much smaller training sets, which are possible to put together by hand using kind of very traditional techniques, which means you can kind of like start to explore kind of like some of these ideas. So I hand drew my training sets so that the GAN would essentially learn how to draw in my style, because I'm really interested in kind of this very traditional kind of like idea of drawing and what you can start to use machine learning to do to push it into new realms. And I deliberately chose to work with ink because the GAN-produced imagery is slightly painterly, and as a material, it already has randomness inherent in it, which is very similar to, as I mentioned, to using a GAN. And it's very difficult to control, and each kind of, and you end up also getting traces of humanness in your drawings, like thumbprints and fingerprints and watermarks and things. And just like with the tulips, the amount of labor that went into making this data set was immense. Hours and basically months. Both of creating these data sets have been taking me months. It's not like pressing a button. It's not like that. It's a commitment to spending a certain amount of time with a particular image. And so it's kind of like artisanal training sets. And you can tell that labor went into this. And I think particularly in kind of like the artistic kind of like community, labor is a valued commodity. And again, you can kind of start to like think about control. So I decided to kind of like restrict my training set to the first 4 minutes that I wanted to produce of the film, so that it would have a level of correctness, so that as the animation progresses, there's less and less of a frame of reference for it to draw on, which kind of leads to uncanny and eerie moments. And again, like, I couldn't exactly predict what happened. And what came out was, it's a really odd sensation of watching it. It's like catching a glimpse of yourself in a mirror before you realize it's you. And the errors of choices that you make when drawing are amplified. So it kind of holds a mirror. This process held up a mirror to my own drawings and made me realize things that I was not aware of. What do I find important? What do I edit out? And kind of like, there's, at the start of the clip, kind of like you can see the eyes and eyebrows kind of flow into each other, because it turns out that I draw them exactly the same, but just flip, so it gets super confused. And some of it is really good, uncannily good. Some of it is less good. And also what I found is even though I spent all of this time preparing this data set and really thinking through, there is a chair, if you kind of like see right there, that sometimes is there and sometimes is not. Because even though I spent all of this time on the data set, I sometimes drew the chair and sometimes I forgot to draw it in. So it's making a mistake, but it's making my own mistake. And it becomes kind of like quite a nice point about training sets, how they copy and learn the humanness and mistakes that are fed into it. And so the mistakes that it's learned is the mistakes that I made. And so this kind of like using it, I then produced this piece, and which was kind of repeating and remembering and recreating that came out kind of like through making it. And this plus the shadow of like all of that, the decay, was something that I wanted to explore further. So I made a second training set, which is showing now, this time drawing the images, the counterfeit lesser images that came out, again in ink. And drawing these was incredibly difficult because the logic of the world is there but not quite there. The shadows aren't quite right, that the twists in the fabric kind of don't hang as expected. And kind of like when you draw, your style is constantly evolving. But because I drew in this style for so long, making this training set, it has now changed, it's kind of become embedded in me, and it's kind of changed how I naturally draw and paint a picture. And I start to add in artifacts when I kind of like, when I start to like draw, and which so it's kind of become this weird hybrid part of my language. And for me, it's really odd because I now have these two GANs which have frozen in time my style that I can then kind of like go to and get it to draw whenever I want. So this piece, which started out as just an animation and now has become several different types of animation and several different training sets, is no longer solid. It kind of like becomes harder and harder to get back to that point of origin of what it once was and what it is now. And the drawings that's coming out of it are looser and wilder than I ever would have been able to make myself. And there's a loop between copying and repetition, both manually and by the machine, and the intensive labor that goes into creating the training sets versus the speed of the program producing the stills. There's an interplay between the digital and the physical. You kind of like, the original film was captured on celluloid film, which was transferred to digital, that was printed and drawn and scanned, reconstructed by an AI, learning again the different patterns and epochs, and kind of like, and the other thing that you have is that celluloid is prone to accidents and deletion, so I drew in things like light leaks and scratches on films, and then in the second time round, I drew in the errors and the artifacts of the GAN, so that they're now part of the language of the GAN that understands, which makes it kind of like very unique to that particular cut of the film and the particular output of that model. So they're both kind of like at once incredibly kind of like easy to produce, but very, very unique. And for me, I suppose all of this leads to the kind of question of where the creativity lies in this piece. Is it me creating the training set? Is it the GAN producing the image? What is the real art? Am I a bricolage artist combining existing things, or someone who is kind of like with thoughts and ideas and memories, trying to convey them to an audience through a new medium? You know, it's a very difficult question. The relationship between me and the GANs that I created is a lot stronger, I think, than if I'd just kind of trained a model on data that I had found, like the first image that I showed you. It knows my style, and anyone who has access to it kind of has access to a bit of me. And I'm still kind of coming to terms with how I see this and where I see it as part of my process. I don't see it as a tool, kind of like a Photoshop filter, and I don't see it as kind of like a true collaborator. I suppose kind of like the kind of point that I've got to is that there is a long history of artist workshops from kind of like the Renaissance through to Andy Warhol. And for me, maybe using a GAN falls into this category. It can copy and suggest, but ultimately the art starts and ends with me.
right, we have 5 minutes for questions.
Thanks so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and I really love what you're doing. I think it's fabulous, and it's great to actually see a kind of a really different relationship to deep learning in creating your creative practice as well, because a lot of stuff is so still, I think, at the stage of, from the arts community, at the stage of how do we show what a network is doing and so on, rather than actually trying to create a more recursive relationship. So I think I'm really happy to see your work. I think it's fantastic. I've got a whole bunch of things I could ask you, but we'll talk perhaps in the break. But I did... struck me that this last issue that you're talking about, you know, where does the art lie, where does it lie? Perhaps it's more, even though you see yourself as a fine artist and so on, I see you more as a performance artist in many ways, because what's taking place is exactly a kind of re-performance of what GAN is doing in a way. So that the relationship between you and the GAN, it's like the adversary and the discriminator, but sort of in an inverse way. And I just wondered if you had any kind of thoughts around that.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that. I'd never considered myself as a performance artist, but I was talking to someone yesterday about how, particularly taking all of the photographs for the tulips, which is kind of normally something that would be kind of like outsourced to Mechanical Turks. And I'm here, this, you know, very nice, white, middle class, you know, Oxbridge educated, drinking my fancy coffee, taking photos with kind of, and that kind of like, and I did feel like this is almost becoming like a performance of kind of like taking these photos, and the kind of like how the power structure of me versus kind of how it's normally done is kind of starting to get illuminated through this process of me doing it. But I think that's a really interesting point.
Thank you for your presentation. You took an artistic point of view to creativity. And from that, I would like to ask you, what importance does the iconology actually play for you in the creative process? And where do you see GANs there in kind of the long haul? Because they probably come more from a pre-iconographic point of view, or try to attack this problem of creating art from that. Like, how important is this other part then?
So just to kind of like clarify your question, like how do I see GANs working in the future in kind of like an artistic process?
If you want to get like the full spectrum up to iconology, like really thinking about like the cultural underpinning that you have, relationship.
The cultural underpinning of like using a GAN.
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think I'm not quite sure how it will work in the future. I think, what do I think? I don't know. I need to come back to you on it, because it is a new technology, and I think maybe that idea of metamorphosis is quite interesting to think about, and I think that's probably kind of like where it might lead to, and kind of like how you're taking things and changing them. But I'm not sure. I don't know.
Thank you, brilliant work. Can you tell us something about the technology you use on the machine side, on the software side, or is this the artist's secret?
The machine, the kind of like the algorithmic part has been more or less kind of like, I do have some control as to kind of like what I'm using. So I've used Pix2Pix, I've used kind of like DC GANs, and I can kind of like, I make variations to the code. So like I'm tweaking parameters and putting different flags to try and get the effect that I want. But I'm not a computer scientist, and there is only so much that I can do. So I don't kind of feel that I have kind of like the level of control. So I kind of like the level of control for me comes in the data set, and I kind of feel that once that data set has been created and I start to use the algorithms, I actually feel kind of like I'm working with, it's almost like working with kind of like biology or nature, because, you know, for me, like I can't really control or really understand how the thing works once I kind of like put it in and set the code running. So it's kind of like this tension that exists, I think, as part of the process.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna.